Hi folks, it's Ross again. Today's episode of the Unwelcome Access podcast is going to be a little bit different. So, as you know, I have a Patreon, and part of that Patreon, which you can join by following the link down in the description, is that if you give me $1 a month, you get to join the Unwelcome Access Discord. One of the members of the Patreon and the Discord posed me a very interesting question. And I'm going to go ahead and show that to you up on screen right about now. Okay, after searching through your posting history to make sure you didn't cover this already, I have a question that comes from a conversation that I had with my wife about some stupid conversation she had with others. What expectations of accommodations does fast food drive-thrus have in relation to the ADA or other laws? Context. We've had some fast food places close their lobbies entirely, and one place that only closes it when the local high school lets out so kids don't hang out there. Lol. Apparently, some people were saying that because there is a requirement that drive-thrus only allow cars and no walk-ups, that means they didn't need to accommodate anybody for any reason. With reasoning like, even if you can't drive, you can get someone else to drive you. On the face of it, this sounds incorrect to me, but I figured I'd defer to the expert before I make a fool of myself. Thank you, unnamed Discord user, who has decided to remain anonymous. So this is an interesting one. One, because I actually am a bit of an expert in this particular area of, how do I put this? Combining the fast food world and accessibility. I worked in fast food for 4 years, all through undergrad. This is going to be a little more of a free-form episode because a lot of the topics I'll be covering are going to get their own episode. Employment, safety versus accessibility, reasonable accommodations as the big one. What is clear and effective communication? And to an extent, this might end up being a good primer for clear and effective communication. But the autism episode last week kind of killed me, metaphorically speaking, that is. And I figured this is a way to do a little bit lighter bit of content this week and give me some time to get my brain back on track and get caught up on things that I haven't been able to do thanks to various issues with medication, we'll say. That said, this is a very interesting question because first I want to hit on closing lobbies earlier than others, as well as closing them entirely. There is an element of safety there, and that's where we're going to get into story time with Ross. So on the screen here, we have the usual story time with Ross image. It is me looking like I am about to do very unkind things to someone while driving a locomotive. So my face is furrowed, my brows are narrowed, I'm staring very intently at a machine, my hands on a control, and yet I'm having the time of my life beyond this image. I have subtitled this one, Return to Taco Hell. I could also probably subtitle this, The Story of Spork Dude. So, go back in time with me for a moment. 2015. I'm just starting undergrad as a very fresh-faced, much more haired, much less bearded man. I was working at Taco Bell. It was one of the few fast food places in Kirksville where I went to undergrad, and it is also one of the few fast food places open late at night. I was a service champion, essentially doing cashier work, running the drive-thru, whatever. And this was during rush week. When you are one of the few late open fast food places, and by few I mean literally us and McDonald's, and it's rush week, you're going to get slammed. And we were slammed. So I decided to take a break, just take a breather before I go and work on some dishes, which was one of my not classes, tasks for closing at night. And I'm sort of leaning against the drive-through window, and all of a sudden, somebody walks over. Now, imagine the skinniest, sketchiest, very, very much doesn't look like they are there for food by the look in their eyes kind of person. And they weren't there for food. They were making a scooping motion. So imagine you've got a hand in a closed fist and it's scooping like it's trying to eat some soup. This guy is trying to talk to me and I can't hear him. The window has safety glass to help prevent folks from getting robbed. I'm basically trying to communicate without words. Hey, I'm not opening the window. It's not allowed because walking through the drive-thru isn't allowed for safety reasons. Now, there's a lot to be said about that, and I'll come to that after I finish the story. Eventually, he gets that I'm not opening the window for him, and he goes around to the front where my manager is taking a smoke. My manager, I warn her, hey, don't be outside. There's somebody who I have no idea what they're trying to do, and they do not seem like they are a safe person right now. And she comes into the sort of vestibule at this area, and the guy comes over. Now, I want to keep this in mind for y'all. My manager is in her mid-30s, and I'm not going to go into specifics, but is disabled and has a disability that would impact her ability in case somebody wanted to cause her harm. She would be less likely to be able to defend herself. And when this dude starts speaking up, he's like, hey, can I come in and grab a spork? Now, fast food is one of the most deadly jobs in the US. And one of the most likely where you are going to be hurt by a robbery, an angry customer, whatever. One of the reasons that lobbies close early and tend to be closed earlier is that when you do not have enough people working, it is more likely that you're going to have harm come to the workers. Now, companies also use this as an excuse to staff even less people during these times to make even more money, but, you know, that said, the safety angle is there, and it's why you aren't allowed to go outside and take out the trash without somebody who is supposed to be spotting you or out with you, and why you're supposed to do it through a door that is locked behind you, and so on and so forth. But for a spork, we are not going to break the rules. And so she says no. Dude starts pounding on the glass aggressively, threatening her over not having a spork. She still says no. I don't believe that this vegetable had safety glass, but she was pretty confident in her no. The guy gets down on his knees and starts begging, please let me in to get this spork. And then goes back to just asking, getting no the whole time. And eventually leaves after about 10 minutes of going through the asking, threatening, and begging cycle. Now, we had to clean up the store. There were only 3 people on the shift and a lot of people coming in from various parties. I didn't have a car at the time, and it was cold and late, so I was waiting for a ride home with this manager. And somebody calls. It's about 5:30 a.m. It's Spork Dude, who is complaining about the worst service he'd ever gotten, how he was going to come and kill everyone, and sort of going through the same rigmarole over a spork. Now, my manager was amazing, and when he said, "I'm going to call corporate on your asses and get you all fired," responded with, "Good luck with that, we're a franchise," and hung up. This was the first time that I had someone to threaten me to kill me over an inconsequential fast food thing, but not the last. And one of the main reasons that, in particular, when you have volumes of people coming in, that's when the danger comes in. And one of the big reasons why, when in this question there is a safety concern, and we will get into that in a moment. That said, one of the main reasons we didn't serve him is that there are some statistics in terms of people who are on foot being more likely to do a robbery. But the other big safety thing is there are a lot of people who are not exactly sober coming to Taco Bell or McDonald's or wherever late at night. There are also a lot of people who are just not very good drivers. If you have someone walking through, you don't really want someone who's on foot, might be wearing dark clothing, might also not be fully sober themselves, whatever, to be in the path of a car. You also have safety concerns with things like if somebody is a chair user, they might present a lower profile, etc., etc., etc. Now, I also think that there are ways to serve people who are not in a car and that we shouldn't be prioritizing cars. But in terms of the current way that the world is put together and that we design our spaces, that safety concern is present. But it brings up a question. Where are the priorities between access and safety? Now, accessibility is a human right, and where possible should be prioritized. On the screen, and because I wanted to put this together pretty quickly, most of the photos in this slideshow are just generic train photos. I have some that are somewhat related, but we have a photo of a freight-like diesel locomotive in blue, gray, and with the Amtrak logo on the side. Behind it, a passenger diesel locomotive facing the opposite direction with the same color scheme. In Indianapolis with a large stadium in the background, some green trees sort of in the mid between the stadium and the train, and it's going over a railroad bridge. This has nothing to do with access versus safety, but when something is going to cause somebody harm, the best thing to do is to not cause somebody harm. Now, I would argue that a car-centric society causes harm, but that requires a lot of getting people to do things like actually having walkable cities and suburbs and towns, and companies deciding to actually develop in that kind of way, including things like walk-up windows instead of just drive-thrus. But at the end of the day, yeah, there is a concern for safety with somebody walking into the drive-thru. At the same time, there is also a concern when you have limited staff, and especially at night. It's harder to find people who are willing to work in fast food at night because that is when it is dangerous. And also, companies tend to not want to prioritize night shifts because even though they were what made the Taco Bell I worked at the most profitable by a huge margin in the franchise I worked for, the others were not that. And so general policy is you have fewer people on at night because it's harder to get people willing to do it, and it is also less profitable to have a full staff at full times. When somebody is more likely to be harmed, or you're more likely to have it so that your ability to actually do the thing you're supposed to do is overwhelmed, that is one of the big reasons where that safety can overcome things. And I'll get more into that with some of the specific provisions of accessibility law. But I also want to talk a little bit for a moment about active law versus reactive law. So this is Amtrak's Cardinal. It is a passenger locomotive with the same blue, gray, and red coming through a railroad crossing with the gates down. There's a passenger car behind it and a fence in the foreground in front of a grassy field with some buildings in the background. This is very close to where I live. It's a photo that I'm surprised I haven't shared more in just general. There is a difference between active laws and reactive laws. And the ADA and accessibility law in general is a reactive set of laws. So an active law is we are going to go out and actively tell you, hey, you can't pump this greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. You can't make it dump chemicals in the water to light the Cuyahoga River on fire. This is somebody actively going in and intervening to make the law happen. It's not, we have found a thing, it is not a reactive law where it is, okay, you're not allowed to do an ableism. You're not allowed to discriminate against somebody. The ADA does have active provisions. The standards are actively telling you what you should do. But there's not somebody going out and checking every building to say, hey, are you following the ADA codes? There are building code inspectors, but not all of them are full, like trained or licensed or anything. And a lot of them have a lot of leeway to approve things. So it makes things like discrimination in fast food very reactive. Hey, I wasn't able to participate and buy your McNuggets or whatever. In those cases, the reactive enforcement is you go to the government, they have 4 federal lawyers doing ADA stuff who say, yeah, this is a good enough case, you can sue them, or they'll sue for you in some cases. And then you have to pay for the lawyer to make it happen. Or you go to the state and the state does it in some cases. The ADA is the best disability rights law in the world, and unfortunately that's not a great thing, in part because it has a lot of really good provisions, but very individualized enforcement in the sense of the individual has to enforce it for themselves. This means that in a lot of cases, where we've come to this point is reactive. It's from, hey, I've done XYZ, now I have to actively, what's the word? Tell someone that they can't do that. And then the time that it takes to have that new requirement spread out into the world. So there are some considerations there when we're talking about fast food, because it is about that it's reactive. And somebody would need to sue or go and actively enforce their rights to make things happen. Let's talk reasonable accommodations, though. On the screen, once again, a train photo. I am at a station and there is a platform that I'm standing on a platform in the mid-ground between the train that's coming into the station and myself. It's got detectable warnings, the yellow strips along the platforms, as well as a lush green tree background, and the locomotive in the sort of across a couple tracks is a metro locomotive in blue and red with 2-level stainless steel gallery cars behind it. A lot of people see reasonable accommodations as a very two-dimensional thing when they really aren't. Think of reasonable accommodations as more of a negotiation process. Going in and saying, hey, I find this a reasonable accommodation for myself, implement it. Or, hey, you're blind, here's the thing we will do for blind people, isn't reasonable for either party. It's a very individualized process and is a level of back and forth. Sometimes the reasonable accommodation is just absolutely fine for everyone. When I was working at the Epley Center for Parks and Public Lands, or Epley Center for Parks and Public Lands now, they were very good about remote work. When they asked me to formalize that accommodation, when I presented my case to HR, it was, why are you asking us about this? It seems like they're very supportive, and you clearly have it well documented as to why. Now, that's a reasonable accommodation in terms of HR. But the same process is true anywhere you're asking for a reasonable accommodation. It's not acceptable to go in and say, hey, we're a podcast that is putting in a sound that is causing people misophonia on purpose, and when people are saying your misophonia is specifically not something we care about and we're just going to keep doing it and you're whining, that's actually an ADA violation. Fun fact. It's also not a reasonable accommodation because what somebody is asking for is, hey, let's enter this process of figuring out what is good for both of us. At the end of the day, somebody approaches you as a business and says, this is something that I am not able to access the goods and services you provide. How do I do that? How do we make this happen? It's generally a good faith effort to make things better for them and so that they can give you their money, their energy, their time, whatever. It is a good thing to do. And in the long run, makes more people, especially disabled people, want to come and show up and give you money. The problem is that it is a process, and people don't like to spend time on it because they think it's a waste of money in the long run, which it isn't. But again, a reasonable accommodation has to be reasonable for both parties. And there has to be proof from both parties as to why something that is offered by another is not reasonable. And it's also, again, as I said, very individualized. I'll have some citations on this in a couple slides, though. But first, a word from our sponsors. Before we get into fast food accommodations in practice. Wow, Future Ross, what a great ad. Or maybe there isn't one. As always, our primary sponsor is you, the viewer, over on patreon.com/unwelcomeaccess. However, this space is intentionally left open for disabled people who have a project, a business, something they want to get out there to help platform people who might not otherwise get a chance to share in this sort of format. That said, back to your regular programming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. All right, so we're back. Thank you, pre-recorded Ross. Let's talk fast food accommodations in practice. So on the screen, again, unrelated to anything about fast food or accommodations, I have a large steam locomotive, nickel plate 765, which is billowing steam out of the sides and out of the top, although it's hard to see, with a tree and a house in the far background, and a blue cloudy sky above. Fast food accommodations, really we have two areas we're looking at. The built environment and a reasonable accommodation to provide. And also that car element is also something to consider. Getting into that, let's start with accessible routes. Now here I have a long exposure photo of a MBTA train in the background, I believe Orange Line, which has a orange stripe on the bottom and silver on top, along a platform with people who are walking on that platform as well with long exposure. It's in a gray building with windows at the top. Let's start talking about accessible routes and specifically scoping requirements. So this is also kind of a primer on assessing a space for accessibility. The first thing you always want to look at is scoping. And scoping is, where is this required? How many is required? What are the circumstances it's required in? So for accessible routes, and this is really the big one that sort of hits that people walking in the drive-thru becomes a safety thing. And again, whether that's reasonable or not, we'll get to. ADA 206.2 is the scoping requirements for accessible routes. It's relatively long, but there are some specific points. I'll also have the links for all this in the slide notes, and I'll have them in the description or on Patreon, depending on. These are a bit longer of a set of links. But ADA 206.2.1 and 206.2.2, which are arrival points and accessible routes within a site specifically, both have an exception that you can't have an accessible route or designate an accessible route to also be a vehicle route. So if it's not a pedestrian route, it's not an accessible route, even if it is for mixed traffic. And nothing that is not on an accessible route can be considered accessible. This is one of the basic building blocks of the built environment for accessibility. We'll come back to this because this is more talking about physical environment. But this is another example of the programmatic access standard in practice. But even if that's also true, there's a specific set of requirements scoping for restaurants and how you're supposed to get around. No discussion of drive-through at all for any accessibility. And the same is true for the next scoping section we'll hit on the next slide. It does provide an advisory hitting on that programmatic access stuff, that the same services, and this is the same services requirement, you should be providing an equivalent service on an accessible route where possible, mostly for dining, having all of your VIP dining areas on the third floor only accessible by stairs is not accessible and is discriminatory. And this kind of gets to the somebody could drive them thing where, yeah, you're still providing that service in the same way that if somebody wasn't disabled and just didn't have a license, they could get it. But let's also talk about the service window itself, because this is another important part with that built environment and design bit. Scoping for service counters is ADA 227. Essentially, it just says if it's an accessible service counter, it has to comply with ADA 904. ADA 904 is those designs. Now, it didn't have a diagram, but I wanted to hit on a couple things. A service counter can be up to 36 inches high, which is notable as a thing here, and we'll see that in a moment. It also allows a deeper reach than most areas, where you have to reach to interact with something. And an accessible service counter also has to be at least 24 inches wide. Now, I have on the screen on the right, and we'll come to the image on the left in a moment, the ADA 308 reach range diagram. And in particular, if you're talking about somebody who can't drive, that might be due to not necessarily having the mobility to operate the car. Now, there are accessible cars, that's a whole other episode. But when you're talking about reaching, that requires twisting the body. You can drive a car accessibly without twisting your full body, which is why it becomes a side approach, which is what is demonstrated up on the screen. Now, a side approach, the thing that you're reaching over, can only be up to 34 inches, and you can only be having somebody reach up to 46 inches. And at the most, 24 inches over. No drive-through window really is going to be able to meet that. But under 904, a service counter can be 36 inches deep, but only 36 inches high. The problem is that drive-through windows are usually 32 to 36 inches high and 14 inches wide. So they don't really have that sort of counter space. And one of the reasons why a counter might be important is that somebody might not have the motor skills to take the bag in the same way, right? Then there's the other part when we're talking about service windows. Also, I got those stats on the windows from QuickServe, which is one of the big manufacturers of drive-through windows. And the following information on car window height is from a document I found on quick Google search from Pedestal Pro, which will also be linked, but it's also the only thing I could find with window heights. Car windows are taller, and I don't know when this data was gathered, but a Honda Accord is 38 inches to the bottom of its window, which puts where you're going to be reaching, sure, you'll be lifted up a bit because you're in a seat. That's going to make the reach range all wonky. And if you're designing for that Honda Accord, sure, you might be able to justifiably have it at an accessible height for somebody who is outside. Here's the issue. Everything else is higher than that. And again, look at this chart. It's wild how high these windows get. But the image on the left also demonstrates it. So that's at the Whitewater Scenic Railroad at their station in Connersville, Indiana. And on the right, we have an old Pullman passenger car with a diesel locomotive in front, just a small little guy. And on the left, we have their parking lot, which has cars and SUVs of various shapes and sizes, as well as in green and red and with a wood base, luggage carts. Now, these luggage carts are a bit off the ground. They're designed to be able to put luggage on there, roll them over to the train, and make it easier so you can have them boarding levelly, get that luggage in without any issues. And they're pretty high off the ground for this reason. In this image, the top of I don't know how old that truck's bed is. It looks like it's relatively newer, is around where that luggage cart's bottom is. It's about at the same level as the bed. It's also only a few inches below the window of the sedan that is parked in front of it. Cars have gotten a lot bigger since the ADA standards were developed as well. And the other part is that the ADA standards were developed originally based on data from like the 50s under the original Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. And they're based off of the average dude who's a chair user from that time period. And haven't been updated really since. So there are a lot of complications with some of this measuring stuff. And also, the main purpose of a drive-through window is to serve a car. Take out any capitalism, take out any fast food BS, etc. And that would still be the core point of the drive-through window, is to give somebody food without leaving their vehicle. It is not really reasonable to say, hey, you are now allowed to walk through here, because that changes the core purpose of the thing. It's the same as, okay, you have a large fire watch tower. That is one of the key things in your park. Well, now we have to put an elevator in it. That's going to completely change the character of that experience. That's not completely reasonable to demand. But I say all this for the built environment. That doesn't mean you can't make things accessible still. Before we get into that, though, I want to talk about car use. So this is a photo I took near the Beech Grove maintenance yard that is here in Indianapolis. In the background, there's a large brick shed building, which is where they do the repairs. In the near foreground, there's a sort of Beech Grove city sign with a car traveling below it, a large truck SUV thing. And the sort of focal point of the picture is a Amtrak locomotive, again, blue and gray and red, that has seen better days. It is in rough condition. It hit a car and is dented and busted in and not having a good time. I will have a link to this as well as have it uploaded on Patreon. Most disabled people who can't travel on their own, as the Department of Transportation puts it, have a travel limiting disability, just rely on friends to get them around. They have to, at the end of the day, you have to rely on someone else to move you around in a car-centric world. This usually is friends and rideshare services. My dad is legally blind and isn't allowed to have a driver's license because that's dangerous, because it's a legitimate safety thing. To get around to appointments and whatever, he has to use a rideshare or get a ride from someone. A lot of people have to bum rides from friends too. Or they have to rely on public transit or paratransit, which in a lot of the US is not very great, because we've designed everything around you are the owner of your own car as an individual and will have that car no matter what. Designing everything around cars is not reasonable for a number of reasons. There are people who will tell you about it a lot better than I have and can. but it is how the world is designed currently. And while I think that we should definitely be redesigning the world to be accessible by anybody, which includes not requiring cars which have a monetary barrier, a ability barrier, and are dangerous for others and the planet, under the current conditions, it is unfortunately reasonable to say, if you are not able to use the thing we have designed for the primary mode of transportation in the country, that unfortunately is reasonable under those circumstances. It is not reasonable on a human rights or in the right thing level. The problem is that, in particular, car use is the way of the world at the moment. That being said, disabled people do adapt. This is a wonderful report from the Department of Transportation that I have cited extensively in the work I've done on transit and travel. Basically, it turns out that disabled people do rely on others and do find a way to go and do things. They are limited in their ability to do it at the end of the day. But that's less of an issue of an individual fast food place and more of an issue of we have everybody being forced to do this. And so whether you have a travel limiting disability or just don't drive, you're still going to be limited. Let's talk about, though, the part of that question that said there's nothing that they have to do, because that's also still not true. So fast food is a Title III entity. Go back to that programmatic access / legal primer if you want to look at that more, but basically any business is a Title III entity. And under that, specifically under Section 12182B2A, there are specific prohibitions against not providing alternate means of engaging, as long as they are reasonable. So I'll read these here, and they will be in the notes, but a failure to make reasonable accommodations to afford someone the goods, services, and whatever that a place provides, as long as it is shown that it would not fundamentally alter the nature of such goods, services, facilities, etc. But also a failure to take such steps as necessary to ensure what I just said, with failure to provide those accommodations and make sure that people are given an accessible experience, unless, again, taking those steps is going to fundamentally make it so that you are not operating the same service. I would argue that people tend to not understand this part as much, because that undue burden has to be, one, proven, and two, can't just be it would cost us more money. It also can't just be, well, you'd have to train people differently. Undue burden is, we have that Firewatch tower, putting a elevator up to the top of it is not reasonable to ask for. The part that is important to note, though, if you can note that you can't readily achieve the barrier removal, or you can't readily do these things, you still are required to make alternate methods accessible. And I'm going to come to that in the next slide as a little what could be done. But there are still things programmatically that you can do for people. There is a requirement called clear and effective communication. Essentially, at the end of the day, clear and effective communication is, are you able to engage with people with disabilities that affect their ability to effectively communicate? Auditory, sight, so on. This is one of the areas where fast food could actively provide accommodations for people who might have disabilities that keep them from driving. Some of them would be very easy, such as making it so that, say, what the worker has said is auto-transcribed onto a board. But there are some fast food companies that have remote interpreting services so that deaf people can participate still. It can also provide assistive listening in drive-through ordering systems, because auditory disabilities are not something that keeps you from being able to drive. But also changing policy and procedures so that somebody who does have a physical disability has a way to order. Every fast food, and let's actually get into the next slide. Let me actually, before I do that, on the screen, the image I have here, I got very into that and forgot to describe this. We have a diesel locomotive from the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad in the background as the focus, with a bunch of cars of various sizes and shapes in the foreground. And the locomotive is in black, red, and yellow, with the red stripe in the middle, with yellow sort of lining. And there's trees in the background sort of starting to turn colors. Last photo I have is also from the Whitewater Valley Scenic Railroad. So we have the black diesel locomotive with a passenger coach behind it, an old passenger coach in green, under a tree with a few cars to the right, with a sort of baby blue little diesel locomotive with a few green passenger coaches behind it, on the same track facing each other, sort of in what can be described somewhat as a standoff, with a green tree sort of in the foreground framing them. Best way I can describe it. There's a lot that could be done for this, though. Every fast food place has an app. Have an after-hours disability, hey, I need you to be able to give this to me and I can't drive option. Have that be something that you can do so that it's even just, sort of like with DoorDash even. Have it so that it can be left in a spot that's accessible outside so somebody can grab it. You could also put in a walk-up window for those after-hours moments. There's also a lot with things like, say, having captions on the order board. The other part is that you could also just staff your stores properly and stop being so focused on getting an extra couple pennies for somebody making minimum wage. And also the fact that, if working with, say, someone like DoorDash, that's going to be a part of the food episode. This is not a discourse moment. But working with someone like DoorDash or Uber Eats or whoever, as kind of shitty as those services are in a lot of ways, they do make getting food accessible for people. A lot of disabilities affect the ability to make food. And that's going to be our episode next week. I've decided this now. Cue me putting this in at the beginning of next week's episode in a derisive way. But having it so that in those services, they cut out all the bullshit if you're disabled. And sure, they'd probably make you have to show it through enrollment in some sort of benefits program, which is a whole other conversation. I say laughing sardonically. But having that as a option, figuring out ways where it's okay, yeah, there are safety concerns, but being proactive about finding places where there are safety concerns or reasons why you wouldn't have the place open super late. And then going in and saying, how does this affect somebody? What do I actually need to do to make it so that they aren't affected? And actually thinking through that. But it's a systemic issue more than individual fast food places at that point. It's that the thinking is, well, we're only going to serve people in cars. It's such a tiny population that will be affected by this. Without addressing that, well, why are we only serving people in cars in the first place? Should we be only serving people in cars? And at the end of the day, that becomes a big part of why these things are ableist. Not necessarily because of those decisions made by a fast food place on the ground, but because the systems we live in are promoting the things that caused those decisions to be made. This was a really interesting one to put together, and a little more rambly than what I have done in the past with this and other things. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments or over on Patreon if you want to see more of these. Throw more questions your way. They might end up being a Q&A video. Thanks for watching again, and have a good day. A huge shout out to the wonderful people over on Patreon who are helping to make this project happen. As always, we aren't getting any ad revenue from YouTube, and you'll also get your name up on the screen right about now, like these lovely people who have helped support the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our next episode. Unwelcome Access is a production of Autism, a disability and accessibility consulting organization.